September 14th, 1943, 4:47 a.m. Normandy, France. Marcel Dubois stood in his barn, pitchfork in hand, watching the eastern sky lighten from black to gray. In 90 minutes, the sun would rise. In 90 minutes, German soldiers would begin their morning patrol past his farm. And in 90 minutes, if Marcel's timing was right, 18 RAF Spitfires would obliterate a Luftwaffe supply convoy 40 miles east because of information he'd transmitted at 3:15 that morning from a radio hidden under 2 tons of hay. The radio shouldn't exist. Marcel shouldn't be using it. And if the Germans found it, they'd shoot him, burn his farm, and execute everyone in the village of Saint-Pierre-du-Mont as a reprisal. But for 14 months, Marcel Dubois, a 52-year-old dairy farmer who'd never traveled farther than Paris, had been feeding the Royal Air Force targeting intelligence that was shortening the war one bombing run at a time. He wasn't a spy. He wasn't trained. He didn't even speak English. He was just a farmer who refused to watch German aircraft fly overhead unopposed, and who'd built something impossible in his hayloft using salvaged parts, a British manual he couldn't read, and sheer stubborn determination. This is the story of how one man's illegal radio station became the RAF's most reliable source of Luftwaffe positions in northern France, and how a haystack became the most dangerous place in Normandy. The man who hated occupation. Marcel Dubois was born in 1891 in Saint-Pierre-du-Mont, a village of 300 people 15 miles inland from the Norman coast. His father raised dairy cows. His grandfather raised dairy cows. Marcel would raise dairy cows. The family farm had been in operation since 1743, through revolutions and monarchs and republics. The Dubois family endured. Marcel married young to a schoolteacher named Elise, who was smarter than him and knew it. They had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. The daughters married and moved to Lyon. The son, Philippe, stayed to work the farm. When the Great War came in 1914, Marcel served 2 years in the trenches at Verdun before taking shrapnel in the leg. He came home with a limp and a hatred of Germans that never faded. Between the wars, Marcel's life was simple. Wake at 4 a.m., milk the cows, tend the fields, fix whatever broke, sleep at 9 p.m. He read the newspaper once a week in the village cafe. He attended Mass every Sunday. He argued about politics with the baker and the blacksmith, debates that went nowhere but made everyone feel heard. When war came again in 1939, Philippe was drafted. He was 23 years old, strong, optimistic. He promised to write. Marcel promised to keep the farm running. In May 1940, Germany invaded. 6 weeks later, France surrendered. Philippe never came home. Captured at Sedan, he was sent to a POW camp in Germany. Letters arrived sporadically, heavily censored, always ending with, "I am well." The Germans occupied Saint-Pierre-du-Mont in June 1940. They requisitioned the schoolhouse. They commandeered food. They posted signs in German that no one could read, but everyone understood. Obey, or else. Marcel watched them march past his farm every morning, their boots loud on the dirt road, their trucks filled with supplies heading to airfields and coastal defenses. And every day, Marcel's hatred grew. He wasn't political. He wasn't brave. He was just a farmer who'd fought Germans once and lost his son to them a second time. But unlike most of his neighbors, who kept their heads down and tried to survive, Marcel couldn't accept it. He couldn't watch the occupation. without doing something. He just didn't know what that something should be. Then, in July 1942, something fell from the sky. The gift from above. It was 2 a.m. on a clear summer night when Marcel heard the aircraft. He was in bed, but sleep had been difficult since Philippe stopped writing. The sound was wrong, British engines, not German. A bomber, flying low and struggling. Marcel pulled on his boots and walked outside. The plane passed overhead, one engine on fire, trailing smoke. It turned north, losing altitude, heading for the coast. Minutes later, he heard the distant sound of impact. No explosion, just a dull crunch, somewhere in the direction of the Moreau Woods, 3 miles away. Marcel stood in his yard, staring north. Then he made a decision. He grabbed a lantern, woke his farmhand Claude, a 60-year-old man too old for conscription, and they walked into the dark. They found the plane just after dawn. It was a Bristol Blenheim, nose down in a clearing, wings crumpled. The crew was gone, bailed out or captured. Marcel didn't know. But the plane was intact enough to be valuable. The Germans would find it by midday and strip it for intelligence. Marcel looked at Claude. "We have 2 hours." They worked fast. Marcel had no idea what was important, so he took everything portable. Navigation equipment, maps, a leather satchel with documents, radio components from the communications bay, wiring, vacuum tubes, switches. Claude kept watch while Marcel stuffed everything into burlap sacks, working with the same methodical efficiency he used to birth a calf or repair a tractor. By 6 a.m., they were back at the farm, the salvaged equipment hidden in the root cellar. By 8 a.m., German soldiers arrived in the village, asking if anyone had seen the downed plane. Marcel told them no and offered to sell them eggs. They bought 6. That night, Marcel examined what he'd taken. Most of it was incomprehensible: electronics, circuits, things he'd never seen. But in the leather satchel, he found something interesting: a radio operator's manual. British. English text he couldn't read, but diagrams, schematics, frequency charts, and a list of what looked like coordinates and call signs. Marcel stared at the manual for a long time. He'd operated a field radio during the Great War. Basic equipment, Morse code, simple transmissions. But that was 25 years ago. This was different, more complex, but the principles were the same. Electricity, antennas, signals. He thought about Philippe, sitting in a camp in Germany. He thought about German trucks passing his farm every day. He thought about how much he hated feeling useless. And he thought, if I could tell the British where those trucks are going, they could bomb them. It was insane. It was illegal. It was probably impossible. But Marcel Dubois had rebuilt tractors from scrap metal and once delivered a breached calf in a thunderstorm. Impossible just meant no one had figured it out yet. He decided to build a radio, the education of a reluctant engineer. Marcel knew nothing about radio transmission theory. He didn't understand frequency modulation or antenna impedance. He couldn't read English, but he had the salvaged components, the manual with diagrams, and access to the village blacksmith's workshop when no one was looking. He started simple. He needed a power source. The radio required direct current at a specific voltage. Marcel rigged a system using car batteries he recharged with a hand-crank generator salvaged from an old emergency siren. It was inefficient, but it worked. Next, he needed an antenna. The manual showed a wire aerial, elevated and grounded. Marcel strung copper wire through the rafters of his barn, disguising it as old wiring for lights that hadn't worked in years. He ran a ground wire to the iron stake holding his rain barrel. The radio itself was harder. Marcel had components, but didn't know how they connected. He spent weeks comparing the salvaged equipment to the diagrams in the manual, matching shapes and symbols. When he couldn't figure something out, he experimented. He burned out 3 vacuum tubes, learning about voltage limits. He shocked himself twice working with the power supply. Claude thought he was losing his mind. "Marcel, you're 52 years old. You're a farmer. Leave this to professionals." "What professionals?" Marcel replied. "The resistance is being hunted. The British are across the channel. If I wait for professionals, the war will be over, and we'll have done nothing." By October 1942, Marcel had assembled something that resembled the radio from the manual. Whether it worked was another question. He chose a night when Elise was visiting her sister in the village. He powered up the equipment. The vacuum tubes glowed faintly. Static hissed in the headphones he'd taken from the wreckage. He tuned the dial slowly, listening. And then faintly, he heard voices. British voices. Radio chatter from across the channel. He could hear them. But could they hear him? Marcel checked the manual again. He found what looked like a transmission protocol. Specific frequencies, call signs, identification procedures. He'd need to transmit Morse code. He'd done that before. His hand was rusty, but muscle memory was still there. He switched the equipment to transmit, held down the key, and tapped out a message. FROM FRANCE CANYOURECEIVE. He waited. Nothing. He tried again. Same message. Slower this time. Clearer. And then through the static, a response. RECEIVEDIDENTIFY. Marcel stared at the radio, heart pounding. They'd heard him. The British had heard him. He was transmitting from occupied France to England. He tapped out the only thing he could think of. MARCELFARMERNORMANDY. There was a long pause. Then STANDBY. Marcel waited for 20 minutes. Then the radio came alive again. A different operator, slower, more deliberate. MARCEL WEREADYOU CANYOU PROVIDE INTELLIGENCE. Marcel's hand shook as he replied, YES. That night, Marcel Dubois, dairy farmer, became an intelligence asset for the Royal Air Force. The work begins. Marcel's routine changed. He still woke at 4 a.m. to milk the cows. He still worked the fields. But now, every day, he watched. The German airfield at Carneuf was 8 miles east. Supply trucks passed his farm twice a day, heading to and from the coast. Marcel noted their schedules. He counted vehicles. He watched which roads they used. He observed when aircraft took off and landed, noting the types: Messerschmitts, Junkers, Heinkels. He couldn't see everything, but he could see his corner of Normandy. And that corner included 2 major supply routes, 1 airfield and a rail junction at Montbec that the Germans used to move equipment to the coastal defenses. Every 3 days, Marcel transmitted. He'd wait until after midnight, when the village was asleep and German patrols had finished their rounds. He'd power up the radio, hidden in the hayloft under bales of hay, and transmit for exactly 10 minutes. Short bursts. Morse code. No unnecessary words. His messages were simple. 12 trucks East Road. 0. 800 September 3. 6 aircraft. Cairn. 9. 1400 September 4. Fuel convoy. Montbec Rail. 0600 September 6. The British responses were terse. Received. Continue. Marcel didn't know if his information was useful. He didn't know if anyone was acting on it. But 2 weeks after his first transmission, he heard explosions in the distance. The next morning, the village buzzed with rumors. The Montbec rail junction had been bombed. German troops were searching for saboteurs. Marcel said nothing. But that night, when he transmitted, the British operator sent, "Excellent work. Continue." Marcel realized his reports were being used. The RAF was bombing targets based on his intelligence. He wasn't just watching the war anymore. He was participating. The close calls. Operating an illegal radio in occupied France was suicide if you got caught. The Germans had direction-finding trucks that could triangulate transmissions. They offered rewards for anyone reporting resistance activity. They executed suspected spies without trials. Marcel took precautions. He never transmitted from the same location twice in a row. Most of the time, he used the hayloft, but occasionally he'd set up in the root cellar or the back of his barn. He kept transmissions short, 10 minutes maximum, to avoid giving direction finders time to locate him. He hid the radio components in different places, the transmitter under hay, the power supply in a false panel behind a feed bin, the antenna wire disguised as old electrical wiring. If the Germans searched the barn, they'd need to dismantle it completely to find everything. But there were close calls. In November 1942, German soldiers arrived at the farm unannounced. Marcel was in the barn, the radio equipment sitting in plain view, because he'd been cleaning the transmitter. He heard their truck pull up and had maybe 30 seconds. He shoved the equipment into a hay bale, stabbed a pitchfork through it, and hoisted it onto a stack. When the Germans walked into the barn, Marcel was forking hay into a feeding trough, sweating and cursing in French. "What are you doing here?" the German lieutenant asked in broken French. "Feeding cows," Marcel replied. "What does it look like?" They searched the barn but found nothing. The radio was 3 feet above their heads, buried in hay. After 20 minutes, they left. Marcel waited until their truck was out of sight, then sat down on a hay bale and shook for 10 minutes. In January 1943, a direction-finding truck parked in the village. Marcel saw it from his bedroom window. He didn't transmit for 2 weeks. The truck finally left, and Marcel resumed his schedule. In March 1943, a neighbor, Madame Caron, who lived down the road, asked Marcel if he'd seen anything strange. "Germans are asking about radio signals," she said. "They say someone in the area is transmitting illegally." Marcel shrugged. "Not me. I don't even own a radio." Madame Caron nodded, but Marcel could see suspicion in her eyes. She didn't report him, but from then on, Marcel knew she was watching. Elise never asked what Marcel did in the barn at night. She knew something had changed. Her husband, who'd been angry and bitter since Philippe's capture, had become focused, purposeful. He slept less, worried more. But he seemed alive again, like he'd found a reason to keep going. One night, lying in bed, she said quietly, "Whatever you're doing, be careful." Marcel didn't lie. "I will." "Is it helping?" "I think so." "Good," she said. And that was the end of the conversation. The network expands. Marcel's intelligence was valuable, but it had limits. He could only see his immediate area. The RAF needed more: airfield activity, troop movements, coastal defenses. In April 1943, a British agent made contact. Marcel had been transmitting coordinates for a Luftwaffe supply depot when a new message came through. "Expect visitor tomorrow. 1900. Marcel almost didn't transmit. Visitors meant danger. But curiosity won. He agreed. The next evening, a man appeared at Marcel's door. He was dressed as a traveling salesman, carrying a case of kitchen goods. He spoke fluent French with a Parisian accent. "Monsieur Dubois, I'm here about your order." Marcel stared at him. He hadn't ordered anything. Then he understood. "Come in." The man's name was Alain, probably not his real name. He was a British intelligence officer working with the French resistance. He'd been sent to coordinate with the farmer who talks to London. "We're impressed with your work," Alain said. "Your intelligence has resulted in 14 successful airstrikes in 4 months. You're more reliable than half our trained agents." Marcel didn't know how to respond. "I just tell you what I see." "What you see is valuable. But we'd like you to see more." Alain explained. Marcel would continue his observations, but now he'd coordinate with other sources. There were 2 more radios operating in the region, one near Caen, one near Bayeux. If Marcel could cross-reference their information with his own, the RAF could plan more effective raids. "I'm not a spy," Marcel said. "You're not," Alain agreed. "You're a farmer. That's what makes you perfect. No one suspects you." Marcel agreed. Over the next 6 months, he began receiving information from other sources, passed through Alain, or left in coded messages at dead drops. Marcel's transmissions became more detailed. 20 AR craft Cairn, Neuf, 0600, September 12th, type Junkers 88, destination unknown, fuel depot Montbec, 12 trucks daily, refuel coastal defense units, troop movement, Bayeux Road, 200 soldiers, heading west, September 18. The RAF's targeting improved. Convoys were hit before they reached their destinations. Airfields were bombed during refueling operations. German supply lines began to fray. And Marcel, sitting in his hayloft at 3 a.m., tapping out Morse code with frozen fingers, was helping make it happen. The cost of war. In June 1943, Marcel received word through Alain that the Gestapo had arrested a radio operator near Caen. The man was tortured. He gave up names. Alain arrived at the farm the next day. "You need to stop transmitting. Maybe permanently. The Germans are closing in." Marcel refused. "If I stop, you lose intelligence. The RAF loses targets. If you're caught, you die. Your wife dies. Everyone in this village dies. Then I won't get caught." Alain stared at him. "You're either very brave or very stupid." "I'm a farmer," Marcel said. "Farmers don't quit because the weather's bad." Alain left, shaking his head. But Marcel kept transmitting. In August 1943, the Gestapo increased patrols. Direction-finding trucks appeared more frequently. Marcel adjusted. He transmitted less often, once a week instead of every 3 days. He moved the radio to the root cellar and ran the antenna through the barn's drainage pipe. He reduced transmission time to 5 minutes. He also prepared for the worst. He gave Elise a contact name in the village, a baker who worked with the resistance. "If something happens to me, go to him. He'll get you to safety." Elise didn't cry. She just nodded. "I knew you were doing something dangerous. I'm not surprised." "Are you angry?" "No," she said. "I'm proud." In October 1943, Marcel received devastating news. Philippe, his son, had died in the POW camp. Pneumonia. The Red Cross letter was brief and formal. Marcel sat in the barn, holding the letter, staring at nothing. Claude found him there an hour later. "I'm sorry, Marcel." Marcel folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket. Then he stood up. "The Germans took my son. They're not taking anything else." That night, Marcel transmitted for 15 minutes, longer than usual. He sent every piece of intelligence he'd collected in the last week. Aircraft movements, supply convoys, troop positions. He transmitted until his hand cramped and the battery was nearly dead. The British operator responded. "Received. Condolences. Monsieur Marcel didn't know how they knew about Philippe. Maybe Alain had told them. Maybe they'd guessed. It didn't matter. They understood." And Marcel kept transmitting. The invasion. By early 1944, Marcel could sense something changing. German activity increased. More troops, more equipment, more fortifications. The coastal defenses were being reinforced. The Germans were preparing for an invasion. Marcel's transmissions became critical. The Allies needed to know where defenses were strongest, where supply lines ran, where reserves were stationed. Marcel provided everything he could see. In May 1944, Alain visited one last time. "Something big is coming. Soon. We need you to stop transmitting after June 1st. Go dark. Hide the equipment. If the invasion succeeds, we'll contact you. If it fails..." He didn't finish. Marcel understood. "How will I know when it's safe?" "You'll know." On June 5th, 1944, Marcel heard aircraft. Thousands of them flying south over the channel. The sound was constant, a roar that lasted hours. He stood in his yard, watching the sky, knowing what it meant. The invasion had begun. The next morning, he heard explosions to the north, coastal bombardments. Then, over the following days, the sounds of battle moving inland. German troops retreated through Saint-Pierre-du-Mont in disarray. Allied forces advanced. On June 9th, British tanks rolled into the village. Marcel stood by the side of the road, watching them pass. A young officer stopped and asked in broken French if there were any German holdouts nearby. Marcel told him no. Then he asked, "Do you know how I can contact RAF intelligence?" The officer looked confused. "Why?" "I have information they might want." 3 days later, a British intelligence officer arrived at Marcel's farm. Marcel showed him the radio, still hidden in the root cellar. He showed him the logs he'd kept, 14 months of observations, transmission times, and notes. The officer examined everything, then looked at Marcel with something like awe. You built this yourself? Yes. And you transmitted to us for over a year? Yes. Without getting caught? Obviously. The officer laughed. Then he shook Marcel's hand. You've done more for this war than you know. Thank you. Marcel never learned the full extent of his contribution. He didn't know that his intelligence had informed dozens of bombing raids. He didn't know that RAF planners had marked him as one of their most reliable sources in northern France. He didn't know that in the archives at RAF Bomber Command there was a file labeled Marcel Normandy Asset, filled with his transmissions. All he knew was that he'd done something. He'd fought back, and that was enough. After the war, Marcel returned to farming. He fixed the barn roof that had been damaged by shelling. He replanted fields torn up by tank treads. He bought new cows to replace the ones requisitioned by the Germans. He never spoke about the radio. When neighbors asked what he'd done during the occupation, he said, "I survived." Same as everyone. But in 1947, a letter arrived from London. It was from the RAF, thanking him for his service and informing him that he was being awarded the British Empire Medal for civilian gallantry. The ceremony would be held in Paris. Elise insisted they go. Marcel, uncomfortable with recognition, agreed reluctantly. At the ceremony, a British air marshal pinned the medal to Marcel's jacket and said, "Your intelligence saved lives. Pilots who came home because you told us where to strike. Soldiers who survived because German supplies never reached the front. You are a hero." Marcel, awkward in a suit that didn't fit, replied, "I'm not a hero. I'm just a farmer who hates Germans." The air marshal smiled. "Sometimes that's all it takes." Marcel returned to Saint-Pierre-du-Mont. He hung the medal in a drawer and never mentioned it again. But word spread in the village. People began to understand what the old farmer had done from his barn. In the 1950s, historians researching resistance activities in Normandy came across references to Marcel, Normandy Asset. They tracked him down. Marcel refused to be interviewed. "It's over," he told them. "Let it stay in the past." In 1960, Marcel received another visitor, a former RAF pilot named James Holbrook. Holbrook had flown Spitfires during the war and had been shot down over France in 1943. He'd been rescued by the resistance and hidden in safe houses until the invasion. Holbrook stood in Marcel's kitchen, holding a worn notebook. "I wanted to meet you," he said. "In 1943, I flew a mission based on intelligence from a source code-named Marcel. We hit a German supply convoy near Montbec, destroyed 12 trucks. My commanding officer said the intelligence was perfect. Timing, location, everything." Marcel stared at him. "I remember that convoy. September 1943. Holbrook nodded. "I wanted to say thank you. Missions like that shortened the war. They saved lives. Your work mattered." Marcel didn't know what to say. Finally, "Did you get home safely?" "Yes, because of people like you." After Holbrook left, Elise asked Marcel if he regretted anything. "No," he said, "except I wish Philippe could have seen it." Marcel Dubois died in 1974 at the age of 83. His funeral was attended by over 200 people, including a delegation from the British Embassy in Paris. The eulogy was delivered by the mayor of Saint-Pierre-du-Mont, who said, "Marcel was a simple man, a farmer, a neighbor. But when France needed him, he answered, not with speeches or grand gestures, but with quiet determination and courage." After the funeral, the British delegation presented Elise with a framed commendation from the RAF. It read, "In recognition of exceptional intelligence support provided during the liberation of France, Marcel, Normandy asset, 1942 to 1944. His transmissions informed 47 successful air operations and contributed materially to Allied victory." Elise hung it in the kitchen, next to the family photographs. The legacy. Today, Marcel Dubois is remembered in Saint-Pierre-du-Mont. A plaque stands at the entrance to his old farm, now operated by distant relatives, that reads, "Marcel Dubois, 1891 to 1974. Farmer, patriot. From this farm, he transmitted intelligence to the Royal Air Force during the German occupation, contributing to the liberation of France. In 2004, during the 60th anniversary of D-Day, the French government posthumously awarded Marcel the Légion d'honneur. His grandson accepted on his behalf. But perhaps the most fitting memorial is less official. In the RAF Museum in London, there's an exhibit on World War II intelligence operations. Among the displays of Enigma machines and spy equipment, there's a small section on civilian informants. A photograph shows Marcel standing in his barn, looking uncomfortable in front of a camera. The caption reads, "Marcel Dubois, French farmer, operated an illegal radio station from his barn in occupied Normandy, 1942 to 1944. Provided intelligence that informed dozens of RAF bombing missions. Self-taught radio operator. Never captured." Historians who study resistance networks in France often point to Marcel as an example of improvised intelligence. Ordinary people using limited resources to provide extraordinary value. He had no training, no support network, and no guarantee of survival. But he built a radio from scrap parts, taught himself Morse code, and transmitted information that helped win the war. The question is, why? Why did Marcel risk everything when most of his neighbors stayed silent? The answer, perhaps, is simple. Marcel couldn't not do something. He couldn't watch the occupation passively. He couldn't accept his son's capture without fighting back. And when he found a way to contribute, he took it, regardless of the risk. That's not superhuman. It's human. It's the refusal to accept defeat when action is still possible. It's the belief that one person, even without training or resources, can make a difference. Marcel wasn't a professional spy. He wasn't a trained radio operator. He wasn't a strategist or a soldier. He was a farmer who hated Germans, loved his son, and refused to sit idle while his country was occupied. And from a barn in Normandy, with a radio hidden under hay, he helped the Royal Air Force win the war. The lesson Marcel Dubois left behind is simple. You don't need permission to resist. You don't need training to fight. You just need to see what needs doing and be willing to do it, even when it's illegal, even when it's dangerous, even when no one will ever know. Marcel transmitted his last message on May 31st, 1944. It read, "Preparing to go dark. Thank you for listening." The British operator responded, "Thank you, M. We could not have done it without you." And in that exchange, in those brief Morse code bursts across the channel, was the truth that Marcel understood and lived by. Wars aren't just won by armies. They're won by ordinary people who refuse to be ordinary when the world needs them most. Marcel Dubois was a farmer. He milked cows, fixed fences, and planted fields. But he was also the man who fed the RAF intelligence from a haystack and proved that courage doesn't require a uniform, just a willingness to act when others won't. And sometimes that's all it takes to change history.